Hi everyone. I'm Beth Ribet, the Director of Repair and host of the Civics Project. And I'd like to welcome everyone to episode 22 on fair housing, featuring our special guest, Branden Butler. Before we begin, I'm going to share a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tone, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihira, the elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emergent. I'm delighted to be joined today by Branden Butler, who is the Assistant Deputy Director of Education and Outreach for the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Prior to joining DFEH in 2019, Branden was the senior attorney of the Fair Housing Center of the Legal Aid Society of San Diego, where for 9 years he was instrumental in creating the first fair housing services program at LASSD. And that program provides education, outreach, testing, and enforcement of fair housing laws. Branden has litigated fair housing cases on a broad range of issues, including a successful jury trial verdict in a sexual harassment case, has obtained settlements and injunctive relief measures, including the creation of accessible apartment units in a disability housing discrimination case, has successfully challenged discriminatory housing occupancy policies against families with children, and obtained voluntary compliance agreements with the Department of Housing and Urban Development in cases of national origin and language access discrimination. Branden has also led numerous broad-based fair housing education campaigns addressing discrimination against persons with mental health disabilities, source of income discrimination, and race discrimination. Branden was president of the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing from 2006 through 2019, where he successfully led the effort to create an annual regional fair housing education conference. Branden began his career as a housing advocate at Communities Actively Living Independent and Free, a disability rights organization in downtown Los Angeles, where he advocated for housing rights for persons with disabilities. Branden is a native Californian and graduated cum laude from Thomas Jefferson School of Law and received the Charles T. Burner Civil Libertarian Award. Branden earned his BA graduating magna cum laude from California State University at Chico. So again, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished guest, Branden Butler, today. Thank you for joining us, Branden.
Thank you, Beth. I appreciate the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here and an honor. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I'd like to invite you to tell our lay audience, folks who are completely new to the subject, a little bit more about what the term fair housing means, or what is fair housing law? What kinds of questions do you find?
Well, I always start by saying, the term fair housing probably wasn't the right term, when we think about this, right? Because it's really, we're talking about unlawful acts of discrimination in housing, right? Because not everything's fair. But the term fair housing, the way I look at it, generally outside of that kind of difficult name is, on one level, it's the idea that, like, look, so long as we're qualified, whatever those non-discriminatory qualifications are for whatever type of housing we're trying to purchase or rent or mortgage, insurance, et cetera, lending, we should have available to us regardless of who we are, regardless of our protected bases. We all are a part of a protected class. And so it's really that idea. So long as we're qualified in a non-discriminatory way, we should be able to have this range of housing options available to us and not have it taken away or harder to get because I have a disability, because of my race, because of my sexual orientation, right? I mean, I think that's the first layer of what is fair housing. And I think in this kind of awakening of civil rights that we've had in this country, the other layer of fair housing is really understanding that intentional housing discrimination is part of our history. And fair housing now means, how do we undo how do we make to change our future based on the past of discrimination that was intentionally done? How do we affirmatively further fair housing? How do we not just discriminate, but we go further and really create true equity in housing? So I think, for me, fair housing is that kind of baseline level of, it should be available to all of us, regardless of who we are, so long as we're qualified. But it's that deeper level of fair housing is really the the term that we give to try to unwind the long history, hundreds of years of discrimination that was intentional. And we'll talk, I'm sure more about that, but it's really that too. And I think that's the conversation that so many folks around the country are having today, is trying to understand, how did we get here? And why are things the way they are? And for that, we have to look at our history. And now we're forced to look at, well, how do we change? How do we stop the remnants of an intentional discriminatory system in housing that existed? How do we end that? And that's really where I think fair housing is today. So it's kind of both levels, the here and now, and also the aspirational kind of future look of how do we create society that we truly want to live in, but we're going to have to remedy the past.
Wow, that's a lot to pack into one legal concept. Great sort of foreshadowing of some of the things that I'm really excited to talk to you about. So you've mentioned the history of intentional housing discrimination. Can you tell us some stories or share some examples? What does housing discrimination look like historically? How, what kinds of things were happening that prompted the creation of fair housing law as an area of anti-discrimination law?
Sure. I mean, and again, we could unpack this question for a whole seminar to break it down. But I mean, I think like maybe a good starting place is, obviously we understand that this country, racial discrimination and segregation was really the rule of the land. And we obviously had a slavery system, a Jim Crow system. We did have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which did provide basic protections for freed slaves, but it was very difficult to enforce. And so we come from a history of really trying to understand that we had a system of slavery, a system that oppressed, it was brutal, and that history really never changed as we went from Reconstruction, the end of slavery, and on. We've been living through this situation where fair housing really has been, I think, historically about racial segregation, right? About intentional racial segregation. And some of the kind of historic examples are, like, we're a country of restrictive covenants, right? It was okay to record a title and say this property shall never be sold to, if you're Black or Latinx, down the list. I mean, you could name every protected basis to essentially create all Caucasian white communities. And so we come from a history where you could, and I always say, check out Mapping Inequality. If you Google that, you can go to all the major cities and you can read the where the restrictive covenants were, what they said, what they outlawed. And time again, people of color and other marginalized communities were kept out. And so a history, part of our history is we had intentional land covenants that restricted where you could live on the basis of race. And lo and behold, now we're living through a time of some of the highest real estate prices in history. And I always go back and think about, but look at all the folks who were shut out, could never live there. And even if they weren't shut out, could they get a loan, right? That was another historic part of discrimination, right? That people of color, women had a very difficult time getting a loan, to face discrimination. And I think the other kind of history of housing discrimination outside of the segregated housing is violence. A history of violence and harassment against people of color and other marginalized communities. And so we have that history. It's a very challenging history, and it's with us. But I think you could also look at it like in terms of other examples, even here in the state of California, where we've had a Fair Housing Act prior to the federal law, which we'll talk about later. But here in California, we faced a recall of our fair housing laws with Proposition 14 in 1964, and even Dr. King was here. But here in California, we overturned our fair housing laws to actually allow private racial discrimination in housing, and that's a part of our history. When we wonder how are things, why they are how they are now, we look back not that long ago to where in a 2-to-1 margin, the people of California voted to allow private racial discrimination in housing. Luckily, the Supreme Court overturned that under the Equal Protection Clause, and we kept our fair housing laws in California. But our history is still very raw. It was 2-to-1, wasn't close, that people believed there was a right to discriminate, a right to keep people out in your house, that your home was your castle, as Governor Reagan would often say at that time. So we have a history of kind of a brutal history of housing discrimination, and and I would say that's really what prompted or cities and counties and states and the federal government to create fair housing laws, was really the brutal racial discrimination that occurred. But fast forward from now, from 1968, the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, to today, there's a lot of other protected issues that have come up, and some that have always been with us. Religious discrimination, right, was a part of our original Fair Housing Act and was part of the history. You can find many restrictive covenants where Jewish people were restricted. Gender discrimination, right? Long history, particularly of women being unable to qualify for a loan on their own. Even own land historically was outlawed. So see, these are some of those histories that kind of came together. But certainly, racial discrimination, I think, was the biggest issue. And of course, our Federal Fair Housing Act was passed only days after Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, as kind of a memorial to him. But I think at the end of the day, historically, we think of restrictive covenants or redlining, which I didn't mention, which was a form of discrimination where essentially an insurance company would put a big red line around an area where predominantly people of color would live, and say, we're never going to insure these properties. We're never going to allow lending in these areas because of race. And then again, fast forward hundreds of years in time, these are the areas that have generated great wealth. And that's a subject for another day, but certainly, it's part of our, how did we get here? And we think of, could you build equity if you couldn't get a loan, if you couldn't get a house, and pass that generational wealth on as we reach home prices at an all-time high? I can't but help but think how the history of housing discrimination is impacting us today and is exacerbating discrimination because of that connection. It's not a zero-sum game where you can just, say, yeah, we're not discriminating now, everything's worked out right, there's equity now, right? And that's not the case. So I think that's our history, and I think it's prompted a lot. But of course, it's morphed as well. And as we were talking about earlier, Beth, the disability rights movement has been real big in fair housing, and is a critical piece, and may not have been at the forefront of the earlier civil rights movement, but certainly today is a critical part of our why we have fair housing laws, and why fair housing laws have been amended, have been all of these issues, especially around folks with disabilities facing high levels of discrimination. And Fair Housing Act was amended in 1988 to include persons with disabilities as a protected basis under our federal law. And I would add, that's part of our more recent history, but that's a really critical part, that disability has been added as a protection, and certainly there was a long history of people with disabilities being facing outright overt discrimination in housing. So yeah, it's a lots to digest there, and we could certainly circle on many other protected bases, but I think that's kind of what brought it out. And lastly, I would just say the other part of what brought fair housing laws was an understanding that the government had created segregation, had exacerbated it. And that's why the fair housing law, our federal fair housing law here in California as well, require anyone receiving federal or state funds to affirmatively further fair housing, meaning that because we know the past was so bad and so discriminatory, we can't just not discriminate. We actually have to go further and find ways to try to remedy the past. So fair housing is also that part of trying to truly create integrated communities and communities of equity. And that's part of our history that brought us here.
Mhm. So much to unpack there. Just to make sure that our audience is staying with us in terms of some of the terminology, I want to ask, how would we explain to someone who's completely new to this area of law, what is a protected class?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, so a protected class is the idea that for there to be a discriminatory act in housing, for there to be unlawful discrimination, there needs to be an adverse act, an unlawful action because of who you are. And how we define who you are is really taking characteristics. You could so sometimes think of it as protected characteristics, and saying that if you discriminate against someone on the basis of that characteristic, which could be race, which could be religion, which could be gender, sexual orientation, source of income discrimination, disability discrimination, we can keep going, national origin discrimination. There's 7 protected federal classes. In California, we have a great many more. But needless to say, we all are part of a protected class. We all are protected, but it gets broken down. Sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. These are all a protected class or protected bases. And for there to be an unlawful act, there needs to be a housing provider. That could be a landlord, could be an owner, could be a bank, could be a lot of folks, real estate agent, who are treating us differently in a negative way because of that protected class, by race, by gender, by religion. And so that's really why I always say the word fair is really, a misnomer, right? Because some things may not be fair, but it may not be unlawful, right? But it is unlawful when it's about a protected basis or class, and you're being treated differently. And that's the essence of fair housing. If I have a bad landlord who's rude, may not be fair, but that's not necessarily unlawful discrimination. But if they're rude and harassing me because of my race, my religion, down the line, now it is. So at a baseline, fair housing really is about, that negative action being done by the housing provider because of my protected class. And if it's not because of that, and we're not making that tie-in, then it's really not a fair housing case, which can always be a challenge because we do feel like, we've been wronged and we need a place to go. But it really needs that tie-in of because of who I am, this happened. And that's, what the term protected class means. And that's a requirement of the law. We need to fall in that river first before we can move forward with a violation of fair housing law.
Okay, good. That makes it very clear. And I also want to just revisit for anyone who wants to be clear on the definition, the concept of a restrictive covenant.
Sure. So the concept of a restricted covenant, basically is with any like land, right? Like real property. There are, there's going to be covenants or deeds that run with the land that tell how the land can be operated, what can be on it, its use. And a restrictive covenant was, among many covenants, which you could say you can never paint your house purple, you can't put a restaurant in your, this property of land, all these various, covenants that run with the land. One of them, was that you could never give this property to anyone of color, any person of color, any Black person, any Asian person. And those ran with the land, meaning that you can't get rid of them. It's a part of the property. So the restrictive covenant was, it was tied to the property, the deed. And so that's, they're obviously illegal now, although, you still may find them on old properties, here in California, around the nation. That's really the idea of it. And so it was a tool used to keep, areas, heterogeneous, meaning we'll keep it all white by saying anyone who wants to live in this tract of housing must be this race or it's not allowed. And that was the essence of restrictive covenants, and it was a very useful tool for creating segregated communities. And when you look at a lot of maps now, and you look at where was the segregated communities, where were they restricted by covenants to only be all white, you'll find that those are the areas that have, in some places, increased the most in wealth, are the most wealthier areas, and that dates back. And when we think about equity and fair housing today, that's our history again. Now, it doesn't mean that's every community and that was every single situation, but certainly that plays a factor when, if you're returning from World War II and you're, a Black veteran and you can't buy a house in Monterey, but you can buy one, further inland where the properties aren't expensive, because of restrictive covenants. You see how that can translate 50 years later to someone lost out on generational wealth. They're not going to be able to pass down that property worth millions that they could have had they not been restrictive covenants in the community.
Thank you. And just want to revisit one last concept. You introduced the idea of redlining, which references essentially insurance companies refusing to insure particular properties based on the identity or the race of the occupant. Want to make sure that that there's nothing you'd like to add to that definition. Just want to sort of for our audience.
I mean, I think that's the traditional idea of redlining, but I think, modernly the term it's been expanded, to really, kind of mean largely, these are areas on a map where people of color live generally, and there will be no investment. So while it generally was about, lending and insurance issues, I usually think of it too of areas of disinvestment, areas where, if you go back again to the Homeowners Loan Corporation, who helped put together some of the original redlining maps throughout our United States, and you can find this on Mapping Inequality. This was a quasi-governmental body that really came in after the Great Depression to rate cities and find out where should there be lending and where there should not be. And race, of course, was a factor in creating these redline communities. So you could think of it as insurance, you could think of it as mortgage lending, and you could also think of it as areas of disinvestment because people of color predominantly live there. So it was, let's stay away from there, let's not build there, let's not do any mortgage lending there to anybody, and essentially keep it a disinvested community. And that's that history of redlining, and a strong one, very strong one, and many examples, if we had time to do mapping, where you can see how it played out throughout the United States.
Thank you. Thank you. And one last clarification, you mentioned mapping inequality. Can you tell folks what that is?
Yeah, and I'll, I probably should have pulled it up here real quick, but mapping inequality is a project. I checked those in University of Richmond, I believe, and they've essentially put together all the original Homeowners Loan Corporation maps that were done in the United States. So right now you can go to their website and you can just Google mapping inequality, and you can check out where you live, and you can actually look to see where the red areas were, where they rated it. And red meant hazardous, don't lend there, as opposed to green, which was this is a solid area, and then there was yellow, or there's blue, and then there was yellow, and then there was red, and that's really literally where the term comes from. But I would also let everyone take a look at this, and you can it has a kind of a long web address, but I would encourage everyone to it is the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab, and I think it's amazing. And I guarantee if you live in a major city and you check it out, you'll be blown away, because behind every map were comments that were put together, and many of those comments today read very, very offensive. Back then it was just how it was, that this is an area that's red because there's lots and lots of Black people living here, and it's stay away. And it was kind of what the language was, and it was other folks. It was Asian community, a Latinx community. Everyone was kind of depending on where you are in the country, areas were focused on, and those were negative factors when you rated the property or the land of too many Asian people, too many Black, negative. And so again, it's fascinating to learn our history, because again, this wasn't like 200 years ago. This was the 1935, 1940s, where these maps were being created. So definitely check that out. And I see you put that out there. Awesome, Beth, because I think you'll find it fascinating, especially if the city you live in is there, because you'll be able to go really block by block. And I know, look at Los Angeles for anyone there. You find it very interesting because the areas that are predominantly Black today or predominantly Latinx today are the areas that were segregated then. And some very interesting comments around Boyle Heights, which was always in Los Angeles area that's kind of known for being a true melting pot, and that's picked up in those original maps as a negative factor, of course. But again, just fascinating to review our history.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine, right, what you're describing is basically the devaluation of property owned by people of color.
Yes.
Then would have made a big difference if somebody was, for instance, trying to buy and sell in that neighborhood.
Well, and I can't,
white folks as well.
major. I mean, I think this is really the connection point in history, because when we look at just, for example, you have historically low home ownership among Black Americans, highest renter, group in the United States per capita, Black people. You make these connections of restricted, unable to get housing, and now we're in a situation where housing is so expensive that past, while not unilateral and across the board, has had a dramatic impact in impacting people. And I just think it's a more tangled story of housing discrimination. It's not just so I didn't get the place. It's really to this deeper issue of, we were kept out from communities and we didn't build the generational wealth of the equity. And now, as we reach all-time historic highs in real estate, these impacts are exacerbating. We're more segregated today than we were at the passage of the Fair Housing Act. We're getting further away from truly integrated communities. And so certainly have a challenge with fair housing. But again, I think our history helps inform us as to why is there a challenge?
Thank you. So you mentioned, that there's in some ways persistent or even increased housing discrimination in some ways today. What kinds of housing cases are coming up for you, for instance, at the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing? What are you commonly seeing happen in this?
Well, it's a great question, and despite the history and like the lead up, our number one complaint, and almost every year, is based on disability discrimination. So one of our more common forms of discrimination is someone with a disability saying that they've been discriminated against. And generally it's a form of being denied what's called a reasonable accommodation, which is the idea that if I have a disability, which just under fair housing law means having a limitation to a major life activity under our state law, it just means that if I'm disabled and I need a change to the rules, policies, or procedures of where I live from the landlord or the HOA or the realtor, whoever, I need a change in their policy or their practice because it's necessary for me to be equal due to my disability. I need that change. That's the type of complaint we get. And so, for instance, it could be someone, asking to have an apartment unit that's closer to the parking lot because they have a mobility disability and aren't able to go a great distance, and that's a change. That wasn't the unit that was available, and you're asking to move to that unit when it does as an accommodation, or you're asking, which is one of the most common complaints, of course, is around assistive animals or a service animal, someone with a disability who's asking for a change to a no pets policy because they have an assistive animal which is necessary for their disability. So, that concept of we're changing rules. And again, we said, fair housing is really this idea of treat everyone fairly, and that's true. But when it comes down to disability, in order to create that, equality, we have to make an accommodation for someone with a disability. That may make it a change. So that's an area where there's a dispute around, was that change reasonable, asking for that closer parking space, asking to be on a downstairs unit, asking for the HOA to give me more time to remove my trash can off the street because I have a disability and I'm on dialysis and I can't make it out. You can see how this can play out almost on any type of policy or procedure. If someone can't comply due to a disability, they may need an accommodation. And so this has been an area where we see it a lot. But other forms, to put it out there, is we see familial status discrimination, which is the idea that you have someone in the home under the age of 18, or there's someone that's pregnant in the home, or in the process of securing custody of somebody, and they're facing discrimination from the landlord. And that could be the form of, well, we're going to charge you more because anytime you have a kid, there's a rent charge, right? That's a problem. Or there's an overly restrictive occupancy policy, right? Making it so that families with children can't live in certain units. And then just kind of outright discrimination of, you didn't want families living here. This was going to be, of course, senior housing is okay. That's lawful to have housing that's going to be restricted to older Americans, but the older folks. But it's not. That's lawful, but you can't do that outside of senior designated housing. So we see familial status, and of course, race discrimination, always present, always very high in our complaints that come in. And I would say national origin discrimination, right? Discrimination because of where you are from, which also can mean primary language discrimination. You're treating me differently because I don't speak English, and you're saying you won't rent to me because of that. I only want to rent to someone who speaks English, sorry. And of course, in California, citizenship status, immigration status, any kind of harassment or demanding that someone provide that outside of designated federal, Section 8 type housing, is going to be a problem. So we see that kind of whole, run in. And let me also just say too, harassment broadly. And we just released harassment guidance for housing providers just last week. But harassment in housing is a big issue, and certainly sex-based harassment, sexual harassment. But anyone can face harassment, whether it be race harassment, sexual orientation harassment. So we see that that theme of cases, and whether it be in a homeless shelter, whether it be in an HOA, low income, or exclusive high-end housing, we see it all. Discrimination, that's one thing about it. It doesn't just hit low income people, it hits everyone. Can be impacted by housing discrimination. But I would say those are kind of the, and let me just lastly say too, because it's new, source of income discrimination, which is a new one in California, which basically means any kind of rental assistance or subsidized housing assistance, which more commonly is known as Section 8 housing, but it really could be all forms of rental assistance, but treating people differently because they have a Section 8 voucher, saying you won't rent to them at all because they're using a Section 8 voucher is now unlawful housing discrimination. And so that's kind of, we are busy at DFEH in terms of all the levels of complaints that come in and all the civil rights laws we enforce. But that's kind of a little flavor of what's coming in.
That's terrific. Thank you for this. Branden, I would love to just hear you map out for our audience, what exactly are the major laws that protect fair housing, whether we're talking about your state of California or at the federal level. So what are these laws that are there for us that amount to fair housing law?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first one that is our federal law, and it's critical, is our Federal Fair Housing Act. And that's really where we get the term, fair housing. Dr. King used to call it open housing. But the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968, and as I mentioned, only days after the assassination of Dr. King, is our first federal law that really was on the books of being our primary law. And at that time in 1968, it only protected, just a few areas of our protected classes, of race, color, religion, and national origin. And later on, it went on to add gender and disability and familial status. So our Federal Fair Housing Act is kind of the bedrock foundational law that we all know. The difficult part about the federal law is it was last amended in 1988. It really hasn't changed a lot. And the last time it was amended was to add familial status and disability protections, as well as to increase penalties. So that's our federal law that's across anywhere you are, whether you're in Alabama, wherever you are, this is the law. Now, California as I mentioned earlier, we had a fair housing law before the federal fair housing law. It was called the Rumford Fair Housing Act, and it was overturned, as I talked about in the proposition. But modernly today in California, we have the Fair Employment and Housing Act, FEHA as it's called, and that is our bread and butter fair housing law in California. And it's very much similar to the federal law, but in California, we have more protected bases than we do under the federal law, more protected classes. So recently the federal government has recognized sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression as being protected. But California has been doing that for quite some time. And in California, we have source of income discrimination. We don't have that at the federal level. If you're in another state, you can say, I'll never take anyone with a Section 8 housing voucher. Not here. So our FEHA, our Fair Employment and Housing Act, is our bread and butter California law, as well as a very similar law, and I don't want to confuse the listeners, but the UNRRA Civil Rights Act is a law in California that protects against all discrimination in businesses, and housing is considered a business generally. So we have two fair housing laws. They both have a little bit of a different remedy, but that's the kind of lay of the land of fair housing laws. Our federal one, which is the big one, but in California, we have a stronger fair housing protections that cover more: immigration status, primary language. So certainly it's more of a home-based law, and maybe one day the feds will catch up to us. But right now, that's our universe of fair housing law.
Mhm. That's exciting. And what about municipal laws? Do cities and counties sometimes create their own fair housing law?
No, that's a great point. Yes, there can be that, and there's less of it now, but for instance, like San Francisco and San Diego, years before the state did, they had source of income discrimination that was protected in cities like that. So sometimes you do see this, and I think Oakland is kind of going further in terms of fair housing laws around specific to formerly incarcerated. Now our fair employment housing laws do speak to this, but you're seeing cities maybe do more and create a process. So there are municipalities that do add to it, but generally I haven't seen a lot more from the source of income and the formerly incarcerated protections. But again, both are covered under California law. So I guess that's the good thing, is the California law is finally caught up to many of these municipalities. So there's more alignment than there was years ago. But you do see it, but not as much now that the state law has really advanced over the last few years.
Okay, thank you. So you're an individual or you're part of a family and you start experiencing housing discrimination, whether because you're trying to buy a home, because you're trying to deal with what you refer to as an HOA, a homeowners association in a neighborhood or condo complex, whether you're trying to rent or whether you're accessing homeless services. So you're coming up against discrimination. What do you do? How do you start the process of accessing or, embracing fair housing law for your own protection?
Sure, great point. And this is where it gets hard, because I'll kind of tell what I think people will do, but I also will tell you that I get real life, which is many of us have faced discrimination throughout our lives, and facing discrimination in a housing transaction may not be your first time. And many folks, they don't want to report it. They're busy, they got life, they're trying to get housing. So a lot of times we don't report discrimination. A lot of it goes undetected or is just not reported. But ideally, that being said, and I understand that how difficult that would be. Ideally, I would want folks to feel comfortable in that if you felt you were discriminated against, and it's a feeling. You don't have to be a lawyer or have the smoking gun evidence. It's a feeling that you felt. And if you get that feeling that you didn't think that went right, or you thought there was a problem, or something was said, or whatever that may be, I think your first area is always remember, and I'll just say this, to keep all the records you can. I mean, just no matter what you're doing, as a part of a civil rights protection, we always need to be keeping records, the text message, and keep that together. But ideally, after you've kind of always understand you want to hold on to that, there's a lot of great fair housing local organizations throughout our country who do great fair housing work, and I would let folks know you should always feel comfortable to reach out to them because they can help you. Alongside that, I would also tell you, you can file a complaint with us, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, or your local, agency, whatever state you're in, or with HUD, because I really like to err on the side of caution. It's our job to investigate these complaints, and not the individual who feels they were discriminated against. I want to encourage people to file. You don't need a lawyer. You don't need to have a briefcase full of documents. If it didn't go right, let us take a look, because there's a lot of tools at our disposal that may be able to help. So at the end of the day, outside of keeping your records and doing things in a kind of I don't want to say a lawyer-like manner, but in a manner to really make sure you can protect your rights, right? We have to live in that age. You should reach out and either to your local fair housing organization, legal aid organization, or to us and file a complaint. We need to do that. I think we hear the word complaint and we think, oh, it's this huge barrier and I don't want to do it. But we're never really going to make that change unless we start reporting housing discrimination, because it's hard to detect. There's a lot of difficulties, and you never know. You may have been saying the same thing that 20 other people have been saying, and it takes that voice to really make these cases. So at the end of the day, I really like to err on the side of file complaint if you felt the transaction, there was something was going on. There was discrimination, and it's a feeling. It's always hard to describe that when someone won't look you in the eye, won't shake your hand. On the phone, they said the unit was available. When you showed up, they said, "Oh, someone just 2 seconds ago got it." I mean, just that feeling of like that didn't sound right, And I think as we go through life, that's what we get. But of course, so much of housing discrimination, I mean, we'll talk about later, is so hard to detect. And that's why I know a lot of folks just never know they were a victim of housing discrimination, because there's no way to find out, because you didn't know it happened behind a closed door. So it's hard. So when you do get that feeling, when you do feel it didn't go right, file a complaint, and it's at least, I think, a baseline civil right that we need to be protecting and exercising.
Excellent, thank you. Let me jump ahead and just ask you, if you were in a position to change the law, whether in the state of California or at the federal level, what would you want to do? So you've got sort of a policy magic wand, and it gets to be Branden Butler's rewrite of fair housing law. What would be top of your agenda?
Oh boy, that's a real deep question, because there's so many levels to this. I mean, I'll give you, I think, what's like a kind of more realistic baseline level, but I certainly have larger kind of press the reset button level on how we do this. But I mean, I think at a baseline, in terms of policy, what should we be doing? How can we do more? I mean, I think the first thing is recognizing that housing discrimination is prevalent. It's widespread, and there's not enough resources put into it to be able to handle the size and the magnitude of the problem. So for example, fair housing groups do something what's called testing, where essentially you would kind of like running a science experiment, send in a prospective renter who may be is white, and sending in a prospective tester who's black, who both have light qualifications, and then having them go to a property within minutes of each other to find out what's changed. What were the differences? Were they both told it was available now, or was the black person told it wasn't available till a month from now? I mean, testing is really one of the, it's been around for a while, and it still is our best tool of rooting out and finding discrimination, because discrimination is hard to detect on many levels. And so, I mean, I think when we think about policy, I think we have to really embrace, we need much more robust testing. It can't just be, nonprofits applying to HUD to just get, a small budget to do testing. We need widespread testing, big level testing, professionally done, with the ability to then enforce it when we get the results, be able to synthesize the data and then be able to actually move forward on these cases. So, I mean, I think, and I'm happy to say in our DFEH budget this next year, there will be a start to this, of actually doing robust testing, because we need to do this to really uncover discrimination. I would also say, related to testing, is how we use evidence, right? Like, California is a two-party consent state, right? I can't just go in and, you had to ask my permission to record this today, and et cetera. I can't just walk into a landlord's shop and just record them. right? Some states like New York are a one-party consent state, and the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York is one of the great fair housing groups. They use undercover cameras and things, and when they do their testing, right, as opposed to having people write reports and go on the stand and prove their case, they do that too, but they're also using recorders and things like this. And so the idea of really making testing a much more thorough and well-funded part of our housing civil rights, recognizing that discrimination is hard to detect. So how can we bring more tools to the table to truly create equity? Because when you think about racial discrimination, unless you have money for testing and can come out there and test a property and have this evidence, it can be hard to detect, which is what the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York, time in their videos and the things they've done will show you that there's properties they've never rented to a Black person in 30 years, and the only way they broke it up was coming in there and doing testing evidence. So it's an important tool that I think, as a policy level, needs more. And then I'd also say, like, the work I do in terms of outreach and training. There's no requirement. If you're going to be running a landlord, or you're leasing properties. I know there's a little bit with realtors and things, but there's not a broad national requirement that anyone related in a housing transaction must take fair housing training, right? There's no training requirement. In the employment context, we take sexual harassment training as part of the law. There isn't that in housing, and I tend to think of housing as the Wild West. There's no HR department. There's no, rules for how this is going to go. So you're on your own often, and it's a real challenge. And I think we need to bring more uniformity and training. There's a lot of landlords who do it the right way. They take it seriously. They take the training. Their staff knows it. But I would say that's on a policy level. And then within that, I would just also capture that, bias, unconscious bias, implicit bias is a significant problem, and across our country, but particularly in housing. And getting out even further in front of this issue with more training, more public engagement and outreach, and really reconciliation to try to do more on understanding the level of bias is had, understanding our history of discrimination, understanding that discrimination is really person by person, it's block by block, it's bias by bias. How do we do more to confront that, and do best practices and aspirational practices, and get away from things that create bias? Sending pictures to prospective buyers or sending pictures of the buyers to the sellers of that creates bias. It could, unconscious bias. And so these are all things we can do, but that's just one level. I think we're really going to get deep and really try to tear this down. I think you have to start looking at, how do you remove bias from a housing transaction? How do you do it? And I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think, in terms of big policy changes, I think of trying to sometimes remove the individual out of the housing transaction, because we know there's so much bias. Myself as a person of color, it's nice to have an agent do the housing transaction, because I know bias is so strong, and so I think on some levels I wish everyone had a real estate agent, and didn't have to be personally involved in these transactions because bias is so strong. But that's a real, for another subject. But I think at the end of the day, testing, enforcement, more money for enforcement of laws, we need that. This is such a huge issue, and as you know, there is no generally like a housing state agency where you can go to. So fair housing groups really are dealing with a lot of the housing issues that are happening on the ground. And I think, more resources, but particularly around the testing and enforcement area, are needed, as well as training. I just can't go back to that. We got to try to prevent discrimination. We can't, we've had the Fair Housing Act for 53 years now, and we know discrimination is still, there's more complaints coming in. How do we make that change? And I think we have to get out in front of it more. Fair housing should be a course in high school. Folks should be understanding it as a civil right. There should be training if you're going to be leasing property. So I think we need to, kind of bring all this together to, as I like to think of, having a strong enforcement arm, but realizing we don't want people to have to go through that, right? To have to be discriminated against and have a case, and then, down the road they get justice. How do we get it out in front of it and prevent it? And I do think we got to do more training, more outreach, and more seriousness around the subject.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you, Branden. So we have just a few minutes left. A couple of our Zoom attendees have shared questions in the chat. We won't get to
Sure.
all of them, but I wanted to at least raise one that I think is particularly important, which has, how has the COVID-19 pandemic shaped the landscape for housing discrimination?
Well, it has. And early on in the pandemic, we released a FAQ on housing discrimination related to the pandemic, because we're certainly concerned that persons with disabilities would be targeted for discrimination, that senior citizens would be targeted, saying, you're apt. Remember when it was, you're more apt to get it if you're 65 or older, cases of, we don't want to rent to you. So I think it's affected the landscape in that especially around disability, the need for reasonable accommodations, right? If you're on chemotherapy and the landlord wants to run in and fix up the place, now's not the time with COVID-19. So I think, we're seeing it affect that way. I also think in terms of eviction and, how communities have changed, that's also another part, as we look at kind of equity and what was the impact of folks losing their job and communities being displaced. So it's had an impact, but I certainly think we're going to see the impact even more as the moratoriums and things end. And now kind of we're going to meet the reality where folks are going to be either forced with eviction, or there may be evictions and folks may need accommodations for disability. So I think we haven't quite got there yet. I think that's still coming down the road, a big kind of issue there. I hope it is minimized, but I think that's how I've seen it affected. But look, I mean, that's also a big question. I used to do eviction defense for many years, and I can tell you that we should come back to another talk on how can we reform the eviction system to actually create more equity for tenants, because I think you've seen this moratorium, some of the changes have actually, like, for the first time, people had some rights, and it really impacted their ability to stay housed, as opposed to, prior to this, you could be evicted for, being $3 late on the rent.
Mhm.
And, I think this pandemic has really forced us to look at equity and say, gosh, is that how we want to live? Is there another way to do this? And we've been lived through a moratorium now for almost, over a year in California around no evictions. And so I hope in some way tenants' rights will be impacted by, can we look at these tools and these models to truly try to create equity? Again, going back to discrimination too, which is, we know what the past was. How can these tools help to remedy the past discrimination? And maybe that's it. But I've seen it. That's how I've seen the impact. And again, just I think we'll see more as folks are facing eviction.
Thank you. So before we break today, I wanted to just ask for our audience members who would like to learn or read more on the subject of fair housing. Do you have a reading recommendation?
Yes, and there are many great authors, and there's a lot of great people in the fair housing community who've done so much work. But if I had to pick one, I would recommend Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, which has been getting a lot of publicity over the last couple of years because it really breaks down the history of government-sponsored racial discrimination in housing and how that's helped create the communities of today. And in talking with Richard Rothstein, who had the pleasure of that a couple of times at conferences, sharing that he shared with me, looking at the decision of Brown versus Board in Education and around desegregating schools, and really shows that had we focused on housing desegregation, we might have desegregated the schools as a result of that. And so this book, I think, really breaks down that history. So I'd recommend Richard Rothstein's Color of Law. And I'd also recommend, if you Google a little video, it's 30 minutes. It's called A Matter of Place. And it's done by the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York. 30 minutes, well done. And it breaks down the history as well as kind of modernly what discrimination looks like and testing. So A Matter of Place is my, recommended. Any staff who works with me, got to watch Matter of Place. It's well done. And Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, you can't go wrong with that. So I think those are two real good books, and a good book and a good video that I think you'd like. Incredibly
helpful. Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful, Branden. And And I know that our audience is left with a lot of great questions, so hopefully more of them will either reach out directly to your division within DFEH or continue to follow up on your reading and watching recommendations. To our listening audience, I want to invite you back next week for our session on filibuster, and we'll return on August 8th to talk about Social Security. And then our student intern team returns to host the Civics Project on August 15th on the subject of public schooling. So we hope that many of you will join us then. Thank you so much, everyone.